So today I want to revisit this little tea box that I made. This was my very first hardwood project, and I made it a few years ago when I first bought a table saw, and I had the ability to do some resawing. So I took this cherry from 3/4 inch down to 1/4 inch, and it was just a really fun skill builder with the unique box joint joinery that I did. And throughout this project, I'm going to sprinkle in some tips and tricks that I have learned throughout the years that'll make this project even easier and faster for you to make. But the first thing I have to do is start breaking down this cherry so we can get started. With my lumber broken down into final size pieces, I can start the resaw process. And here's a tip. I've learned, especially with less powerful saws like a job site model, it's important to take shallow passes and flip the board end over end after each cut. By taking light passes and going at it from both sides, you're less likely to bog the saw down. And after each pass, you just raise the blade and do it again. Just stop when you reach this point when there's a little bit left in the middle. All right, so when resawing at the table saw, you could just cut this board completely off, but that gets a little bit scary when this thin board is then trapped in between the blade and the fence, and it could cause some issues with everything going on there. So I like to leave it attached, leave about 3/8 of an inch or so, and then you can cut it off later. Now, the first time I ever did this, I cut it with a handsaw down the middle. Totally doable. It is just a little bit labor intensive, but you're not cutting that much material, so it goes pretty quick. The other way, since I have a bandsaw, is I'm going to cut them all at the bandsaw and then clean off those excess ridges with the planer real quick, and then we can move on and cut the rest of these out. Now that the lumber is resawed, I'm going to cut the box sides to final size with a crosscut sled, which is an absolute necessity for this project. Anytime you're cutting really small parts, it's smart to use a sled so it can do all of the holding for you, so you can keep your small piece nice and stationary. Plus, we're going to need the sled to cut the joints anyway. But before we get there, I'm carefully labeling each piece so I get the green wrap right on these boards. And it's not super important since box joints is going to be end grain to edge grain anyway, but it'll look better if I keep track of it now. And the second thing I'm doing is laying out the box joint to make them even, leaving one slightly thicker so when I cut the lid off, there's space for it. But first, let's head back over to the crosscut sled where I have a flat tooth ground blade installed, which is essential for leaving a flat bottom joint. And all I'm doing is taking one pass with the table saw blade, which will leave a 1/8 inch gap for the pins. And with those cut, I can then use the slots as a template to mark the edges of the pins so that I can cut corresponding joints on the box sides. And it's a bit more time intensive to make box joints this way, but I think it looks a lot more custom and actually has a similar look to dovetails, which is pretty cool. Now the trick here is just to sneak up on your cut and then do a little test fit, and then slowly trim on the areas that are a little bit too tight until you get to a perfect fit. You might have noticed those fingers were a touch long, which I did on purpose so I could flush them up after the glue up. And with the fingers locked off, it's time to cut off the top. Now you could turn the box on end and cut through this short side with the table saw, but that's a bit scary. So instead, I'm going to use the bandsaw to cut through, and then I'll clean out these little ridges that are left behind with the hand plane. While I wrap up the lid for installation, I want to talk about a popular woodworking topic: wood movement. My plan is to do the opposite of what you should do and not allow for any wood movement at all. And that's because this lid is small enough and the joinery is strong enough that it shouldn't matter. And if you need proof, well, I have this 5-year-old box that I did the exact same thing to, and it ended up perfectly fine. And as a woodworker, I always find myself overthinking and overcomplicating my builds, but sometimes the simple solutions are the right ones, and this simple, fast solution is just what I needed to make some progress. And speaking of progress, I'm making the interior dividers which will create spaces for the tea bags and help hold the lid on. Now, anytime you're making a part that has to fit exactly, put the tape measure away and instead slowly trim the parts by cutting a tiny bit at a time until it slides right in. And once you have your parts fitting, well, throw some glue in there and call it done. I thought about adding some V-grooves and making this way more complicated than it needed to be, but then I remembered this interior structure is really just to hold some tea bags apart, and figured butt joints and glue would be plenty strong enough for that. All right, so confession time. You might have noticed that this box lid and this box lid do not look the same. And that's because when I measured this, I forgot to measure the sidewalls. And when I cut these sidewalls, I cut it to the same measurement as the top, which means I didn't have any space to create this overhang lip. Now, I'm gonna roll with this one as is, but I don't like the look of it as I have it. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna fix it. Off camera, I added some layout lines to guide me as I plane, but this is typically what I'll do anytime a part isn't looking quite right, and it's usually because it's just too thick. And I found the solution is always to remove material. So I'm adding some facets to give the lid a handmade look, but a round over or a chamfer would work just as well. But the last thing to do is address the handle. And while I make that and finish this one off, let's jump back to the beginning where I said I wanted to recreate my very first hardwood project. And honestly, I failed. This box doesn't look like the original, but I'm okay with that because I've come to realize woodworking isn't about where you end up, but about how you got there. The process, the planning, and the mistakes along the way create a new, unique, one-of-a-kind thing. And while I'll only be able to enjoy the box briefly before it heads to its forever home, I'll always be able to appreciate the work that went into its making.